Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Latio on the Record. It's Wednesday, March 26th, when we're recording this, and I am joined here by some fantastic people to talk about the TJ actions, exploit, vulnerability, incident, whatever you want to refer to it as. And those people are, first, Shara Hardiman, who's the Director of Marketing at Migo, Rami McCarthy, who's the Principal Security Researcher at Wiz, and Shay Berkovich, who's the Threat Researcher at Wiz. And all of these people were involved in different capacities of looking into TJ actions, publishing content about it. And I'll let Rami go ahead and start the stage of what the heck is TJ actions and what happened, and what are we dealing with?
Yeah, great to start with a little recap and glad to be here. So TJ Actions has been unfolding for the past couple weeks as what I would deem communal instant response to a supply chain issue, primarily around GitHub Actions. To unwind some of those, word salad. So GitHub Actions are small modular pieces of code you can use as part of CI/CD, as part of automation, tied to the GitHub platform. TJ Actions is actually a single person who has built a lot of these and open sourced them for the community, one of which called changed files is a very simple piece of code, does what it says on the tin, and 20,000 GitHub repositories have imported and used this little module inside their GitHub Actions workflows just because it makes their life easier. And about a week and a bit ago, unfortunately, we started observing, and this was first reported by Step Security, that changed files repository and the connected actions and everyone using that action seemed to have been impacted by an attack that had inserted malicious code that would ultimately expose GitHub secrets that were used in these workflows that were using changed files. So at a high level, we have a case of a single maintainer who is, out of the goodness of their heart, maintaining a critical piece of the supply chain that somehow gets malicious code injected in it and impacts many, many very large organizations, and to which the community responds. And so I think I'd put a pin there at the very high level of what we're talking about, and happy to, throughout the conversation, go deeper on the specifics of the timeline and the 3 to 4 other layers of this chain that we eventually discovered.
Well, I'm curious if you had the same experience I did, which was when the Step Security blog came out, it was pretty quickly after that GitHub took the repo down. And so I'm trying to just find information about TJ actions. And then finally, when the repo was back up, I saw that the maintainer's name was Tanya Jack. And I was like, oh, is this just TJ? Is this one guy? I mean, how long did it take for you guys to sort of dig in and figure out that process?
Yeah. So I think we had some advantages and we got lucky, and that's always how this happens. So the advantage is that I actually, in a past life, actually did security work before pivoting into research, and I've used TJ Actions changed files.
That is a little cheat.
I've used it. And so I did see the Step Security blog, full credit to them for publishing early and catching this. And there's a great, every instant is told in Slack messages, Slack message from me saying, I think this is a bad one, at, midnight local time, right as that blog came out. Thankfully, catching it that early did mean I had a chance to archive a variety of useful code pointers before they were taken offline. And then because Wiz is this global research organization, we were able to, take the breath to determine whether this was actually worth a research response. Because not every issue that gets published merits research. Some of them are, if there's a new vulnerability published, we have a team that will make sure that that's represented well in the product, covered appropriately. If there's an incident impacting a single organization, obviously that is, not something we're necessarily going to invest in if that organization hasn't reached out to us. However, in cases like this, when we see something impacting potentially the world, it's part of the job for us to dive in. And starting the next morning, we really had a concerted response across research to figure out what's going on, what's the root cause, what are the appropriate mitigations across the parts of our research organization that are customer facing to make sure our customers had up-to-date, meaningful, tuned information so they're not reading 16 blog posts that are content marketing, as well as working to enhance the product with detections specific to this attack chain, to look into our data sources to discover whether generic detections and detections that are aimed at this class of vulnerability and class of exploit had fired. And then, we spend, I would say, the first day in a pretty clear reaction to the TJ Actions Changed File incident. And then the next day, when I got a chance to breathe, I dug a little deeper. And this is where we find the next layer down, which is it turns out there was a second action, which is the review dog action setup, had also been compromised and had also had an attack against it. And that was a chance for us as a research org to add something to the conversation beyond just clarity and depth, but also like net new information we discovered.
Yeah, I want to even before we get to the review dog step of things, how did you guys respond to the eventually the repo comes back online. The maintainer says it was a privilege access token that was the cause of it. At that point, did you already know that that's what had happened, or were you with everyone else like learning it from him? And then what I found super challenging was like I just couldn't find a way to verify that because there was like one conspiracy theorist on Hacker News that was like, "How do we know that's real?" And I was like, "How do we know that's real?" And then I started going down the path of that.
Yeah. I think that we're limited to public information in this case. So, specifically, we never actually have talked to TJ about this incident. My feeling personally, and I don't know if Shay's aligned with this or not, is that there were enough people trying to ambulance chase him. And unless we had something valuable to add, information we didn't think he had access to that could help him in the response, we weren't going to crowd his already busy life now in dealing with this incident that, through no fault of his own, was I'm sure, taking over a lot of his attention. And so, did we know anything the public didn't? Well, I think we knew a lot more than the average bear. Specifically here, though, it's much more heuristic than definitive. So, given that we pretty quickly, along with the industry, figured out that tags were overwritten to point to a malicious commit, we pretty quickly figured out the commit appeared to be on a fork. Those are not signs that the maintainer has gone rogue. A single action by a person who maintains many on a forked commit, as opposed to something that could have been much more stealthy within the actual code base itself, potentially. And using the sort of payloads it did, heuristically, you expect a compromised Pat. Now, the question is this a compromise at that workflow level? Is it a compromise at the repo level, the maintainer level? Is it TJ? Is it someone else with access, right? Those questions were something that, the heuristics don't necessarily give us any clear signposts on at that point until we find further indications about the attack chain.
And just to jump in really quickly, because I think we glossed over it, one thing that stood out as you're talking through this is one, the level of impact and like the scope of potential impact. And I think a lot of the times when we talk about incidences, it's almost isolated to like SMB or mid-market companies, but this like touched every company potentially. I think the other thing that stood out was a single individual, a single like maintainer had this much power. And then more importantly, like how do you one, like verify that you're researching in the right direction, you're moving fast enough to your point, give like public awareness, but more importantly, also protect your customers. And if you're using it, your company. So I love to understand like when it comes to just you guys disclosing and sharing and trying to make sure you can kind of sound the alarm. Why were you guys kind of like leading that effort and not something like a GitHub or even the maintainer? Like, how does this actually work? I think for me, that'd be super interesting to listen in on.
Yeah. Shy, you want to swing?
I can scratch the surface. I think for us it came in spikes. I guess there were activities, so we were just looking for things, and the basic tools that we had were public workflow logs that were an indication that whether that particular workflow was compromised and the timestamp. And we also looked at the like James's tool as well that signifies that the workflow logs contain the SHA of the action that was used. And that SHA could use as a commit reference on the forks. And luckily, I mean, goes to both directions. GitHub maintains the fork tree and the commits, even if the attacker removed and deleted their forked repositories, that commit is still there. So we could look at it and understand whether that payload was vulnerable or malicious or not. And those breadcrumbs going through the GitHub archive just basically slowly building the picture, and that there was no significant spike around the TG actions. But then when we finally had a breakthrough, when Rami had a breakthrough with the review doc, as he said, we had enough interesting information to go ahead and contact the review doc and maintainer. Correct, Rami?
Yeah, and I think that that's a great point. So you asked about also the GitHub side, the Coinbase side, maybe even like why are we as researchers, and even why is Wiz, like, how are we choosing to publish? How are we choosing to serve customers, the community? I'd say that our priorities were always focused on the maintainers, followed by our customers getting early warning, followed by making sure we weren't biasing towards our customers when things impact the industry. So to unwind that, Review Dog's a great case because this is something that we found versus TJ Actions where we were sort of in the mix. And so with Review Dog, as Shay mentioned, we went to the maintainer first, and actually we spent significant time working with the maintainer before we published. And that was really important to us because we wanted to make sure that we gave the maintainer the best chance possible to not ruin their evening, as it were, while understanding that this was actively under exploitation. And so we had to do these parallel tracks. Normally, you want to like give someone 90 days if there's a vulnerability, if you're project zero. We don't have the option here. But what we did want to make sure is that we weren't focused on getting the blog out and not focused on fixing the issue. And like, why us? I mean, it's bystander syndrome, right? Or counteracting that. We consistently felt that we were going to be able to give a actionable, high signal piece of information into the industry that we weren't seeing elsewhere. And when that wasn't the case, we actually sort of avoided publishing at certain junctions.
Yeah.
Until we had something useful and meaningful to say. On the impact side, for example, our first TJ Action blog, I think the core motivation for us in like what different do we have to say here was minimizing the perceived impact. The initial publications around this really emphasized like 20,000 repos and these big numbers. And we wanted to cut through that noise because that's what Wiz does like culturally and say, look, you have to have a public repository and secrets. And once you cut down the funnel, that's a much smaller impact. And that this is still serious. And even if you're in a private repository, you want to fix this. But like, let's get out the word that the fear mongering that's happening around this issue is maybe not in the best interests of customers or in the best interests of the industry.
Yeah.
And then with Review Dog, it was about a response that needed to be had. And then later with Coinbase, it was actually about providing that color on the attack chain that hopefully could kick off other investigation. That was really us hoping to speak to other researchers as well and to the community and continue providing information that we thought putting it out there would allow other people to respond more effectively, to discover more here, and bystander syndrome to fill that gap. Because to date, we haven't heard a lot official. The maintainers have both put out really wonderful, thoughtful, colorful descriptions of what happened to the extent they're able to comment publicly. But vendors are having to fill the space, and I think people are doing it to varying degrees of quality and quantity.
And just to like touch on that, I think you're hitting something that's so important, specifically in the industry that we play in. I think as security vendors, as security practitioners, as researchers, like it's so important to take a step back and ask those questions. And the fact that there's a level of like thought and consciousness from a step perspective of like, where do we start? Where do we go next? And how do we disclose that? It's so important. And I think to your point around fear mongering and the FUD tactics when it comes to like sharing what happened, I don't know if it's a conscious, like, to get people scared so they buy X, but it's more of like, let's just copy what somebody said, not knowing that that's just the first part of their research, like sharing, like, hey, we're raising the flag that something has happened. We're still doing the research on the back end. And there's this, I think, bad habit of like regurgitating content, specifically from companies, honestly, like Wiz, that have the team, that have the resources to like have that big swing to put this stuff out. And you want to jump on the bandwagon, but it's disruptive and it can be potentially destructive to your companies that you're working with. And I think the level of weight and responsibility, we've kind of like moved away from that as an industry. So the fact that that was part of your research process, that was part of your comms process, and how you're thinking about protecting your customers and informing your customers is just so important. And this is specifically coming from like the go-to-market side. Like I can't stress how important it is to like sit down and have conversations like the ones we're having right now. What happened? Why did it happen? How should we be sharing this with people? How can they protect themselves going forward, right? And like, more importantly, what are the learnings? So I just wanted to like comment on that. I think it's so important to like be responsible in how you disclose, and obviously in a very timely manner, but when you can, like take those like second and third layer questions where possible.
Well, then going into that disclosure that then you actually did the Review Dog thing, because to me, the attack seems super weird. Like, first of all, I don't know if Step Security would have caught it if it didn't go to gist.github.com instead of github.com. Like, it showed a network.
So that process tree, I will just say a lot of products have the
Yes.
ability to catch that, Wiz included. And so I don't think that the just flag, like, I think there would have been a meaningful alert happening based on self-hosted runners having that process tree, regardless of the host. So I don't know if they'd been as quick on it. I don't know if they had something like specifically tuned to known payloads, but I think this was going to get caught very fast just due to the payload used.
Well, I thought that was weird, and then I thought it was just a weird way to even go about it. To me, I would expect that you try to exfil these secrets to like an attacker hosted server. And I think so. What tipped you off to keep looking past TJ actions, and then from there, even I guess we can start with that. But I also want to talk about just how you even from there kept digging to like there was a targeted version of this that was more sophisticated that sort of destroys the idea. My idea was like this guy either has like no idea what he's doing or it's like a security research gone wrong kind of scenario, but you really revealed that it was like a targeted sophisticated thing.
Well, it could be targeted sophisticated security research gone wrong. Let's like we
That's
can
true.
be many
Yes.
things at once.
Maybe that's why
I do-
Coinbase is not talking about it. It was them all
I
along.
still hold that the entire attack chain is, I would say, very weird. And we can go into details of like what makes us think that. Specifically, I would say the like mutation around the payloads. If we just look at the part of these attacks that exfiltrate secrets, there were, I think, at least 4 different payloads we've seen. And they happen in a sequence that sort of fluctuates in sophistication and delivery mechanism in a way that does not feel like someone learning and improving, nor does it feel like someone with a consistent TTP. Look, there was a really great mention of like how we respond, how we write about these incidents publicly, folks who just churn out regurgitated content. A big part of what I feel is important and what I think Wiz tries to do here, other sources, and be willing to point to other people who've done good research. And so the thing I'd say about Review Dog and I'd say about TJ Actions is like, look, Wiz somehow had a leg up because I pay attention to the Hacker News comments. And there's a person who is tied to ClickHouse who was exploring the data set and gave some breadcrumbs that just most of the industry was so focused on writing blog posts that they weren't seeing that lead, whether parallel construction or not. And then Adnan, who obviously is like probably the person on this class of vulnerability and exploit, gave a pointer to Review Dog. He started looking into it, and like full credit, before me, we cited in the blog post, he tweeted out that there was something weird with Review Dog, and then he like went to bed. And, you know, like I am so glad this is the sort of handoff I'm talking about in the industry that we try and take part of. He could have kept that in his back pocket until he felt like he had a blog post or bug bounty or Wall Street Journal feature. But instead, he just tweeted it out, as they say. And I picked up the ball and just carried it over the line. And specifically, he found that the action was implicated, and I found the commit, and he could have found this in parallel. I would not put it past him, but I found the commit that had sort of evidence that there actually was an exfiltration payload, and then we could start to draw these dots together. And so again, I think it's really this community response. It's almost like the security industry's immune system to this sort of supply chain incident where I don't know if I'd give the industry credit for like still passing information on vendor blog posts and Twitter and GitHub issues that then get deleted that you have to have a PDF of or you're screwed. Like, but nonetheless, it worked in this case. A hint from Hacker News, a tweet from Adnan, you know, myself having, you know, a taste of something and chasing it. That's how these things come together. And then we put them back out into the universe and hope that someone else takes the next step.
So I was chasing the wrong Hacker News comment, like the conspiracy guy on the pet. When it comes to looking up, like finding the actual commit, was that via GH archive or is that, how'd you find that?
This is a great question. If I recall correctly, it was not via GH archive. It was via, I want to say, workflow logs in the GitHub UI. Because I don't think I was particularly in GH archive until we started doing the Coinbase side. Like I had GH archive and I was digging, but that's actually Shay is the one that really dug in on that side of the logging. And I was mostly in workflow logs and also workflow configuration. I think finding the chain of like TJ Actions changed files, you know, uses whatever, uses Review Dog. That chain also gave me a lot of confidence because, you know, being able to sort of tell a logical story about how these things happen for me is a really important part of tuning down your research process, right? Like it's not about wild guesses. It's about there's an infinite potential space for how things can have happened. And you have to give yourself like the best possible at bats against deep dives. So you don't just spend all your time focused on conspiracy comments and hacker news. And so like coming up with a plausible narrative that I try and debunk, that's my methodology at least.
When it comes to the review dog piece, I think I saw something about that it wasn't actually that like automated, because all the early posts were about the automated approval process, but it was something else.
Well, funny how that works. They were all about the automated approval process because Anon tweeted it and then I put in a blog post. So again, plausible stories. I think we highlighted the invitation workflow because it was a really good plausible story and we couched it in not having evidence. And the end result was that it was not implicated. So specifically, just for folks who weren't following this as navel-gazing as we all were, ReviewDog had a process to try and encourage community contribution because it's an open source project. That meant if you made a contribution, you would get invited as a contributor, which would give you code access. That, as security people, is scary, but was coming from a very good place of trying to build a stronger maintainer base. And when we initially saw that, a thought was it would be very easy for an attacker to make a benign typo fix, get invited, and use that as their toehold. In this case, the ReviewDog maintainer was able to work with GitHub support to determine the user whose identity was used for that part of the attack. And that user was a sort of longer tenured member contributor and not someone who had like just gotten added a day ago from the invitation workflow.
That just seems so wild that someone can just get added. Like, sorry, how does that process work? Just because I'm listening in and I'm like, that sounds like a very like simple process without being able to like verify anything. So just to make sure I understood correctly, you're saying like if I was a maintainer, let's say in GitHub, and I wanted to like contribute, I could openly contribute and have access to code that is embedded in other people's like environments. Is that
so? Open source is open. We desire everyone to be able to contribute back. It's why we work in the open. If you were to open a PR on a ReviewDog repository prior to the incident, they've discontinued this process and fixed a typo. They had automation, I think in fact itself a GitHub action, that would offer to, if you would like, add you into their organization, at which point you have access to contribute without being an external party. So do we just add people is kind of an interesting discussion because it all comes back to this like reputation of open source GitHub actions that's pretty scary right now. I actually was doing again, we're constantly doing little bits of research and diving throughout this process. One thing I looked at was started scraping Popular Actions contributor base sizes because ReviewDog had, I think, 130 something contributors to the organizations. That's 130 something people who could either trivially change the action, be malicious, or get compromised, as we saw happen here. And it turns out that it is not uncommon for Popular Actions to be tied to large contributor bases. And notably, for example, there's a multinational company that has a couple open source actions and I think like tens of thousands of GitHub members of their org. And I'm hoping that the privileges inside that bundle are a little more restrictive, but I would not count on it. So yeah, in this case, there were a lot of people who had access.
One of the things I would love is to see GitHub actually let people see like maintainers and settings. If a maintainer wants to make that public so that at least security tools, because right now all these security tools have like a reputation score and nobody pays attention to it because it's purely based on like how recent was the last commit and how many stars does it have. And to your point, it's like, whether I have 50,000 maintainers and they're all open tokens on the internet, or it's just one maintainer in like a pretty protected setting for a company, like you have no way to actually determine that. And so I don't know how you feel about it, but I mean, I just think about the fact that a lot of people have deployed my like insecure Kubernetes thing and how often I just like treat that like my personal project. Like people should be more freaked out in my opinion, but I don't know how you guys feel about like, I feel like we are way under freaked out about our open source usage from a incident security standpoint, because instead we've chased like CVEs. Like how many CVEs does my insecure Kubernetes deployment have? 0. But how insecure is it? Like pretty insecure. So yeah.
Are you talking about misconfiguration at this point, which are not technically CVs, right?
Yeah, that's what I mean. I feel like as an industry, we've not focused enough on the secure configuration of our upstream contributors because we've instead focused on like how many CVEs are in this repo. But I don't know your guys' thoughts on that.
Maybe I want to say what particularly freaked me out in this incident is the depth that the attacker was able to go to find the vulnerability, right? Because it looks like the Coinbase was the primary target. Then they looked, couldn't find anything there. They went after TG Action. Then they went step up after ReviewDog. then they performed the lateral movement. So we're drawing some kind of graph here, up and then lateral movement of the contributors. And one of the contributors had perhaps some way of leaking the path, potentially in different repository, right? Not in review. So we kind of 3 steps up and one aside. And if we draw this tree from the Coinbase or from any potential target, this tree is really wide, and this is our attack surface. Suddenly, our attack surface is huge, and go figure and go protect it. That's what disconcerting.
Yeah, I mean that was when Rami did the review dog post, I was immediately like, oh well, at this point, like any GitHub action could be compromised. Like we have no idea until, we're done checking every like history. And there is no like mass historical scan of all GitHub actions in the way you'd have to do to check for something like this. So first, Rami, do we know how the access token from the review dog contributor was leaked, or that's just up in the air?
We're waiting on at every step. There are a series of logs that we have available publicly. There are people involved, and there are a series of logs that are only available to GitHub. We saw this with TJ Actions, we saw this with Review Dog, we saw this with Coinbase, and now we're seeing this with the fourth layer here. My understanding is that the highest probability right now is that a pwn request, which is the very classic thing we all wondered was happening when this first was announced, which is where if you use like say pull request target, I can just open a PR and do whatever I want and exfiltrate your secrets. Like it's a very naive form of attack versus some of these pad compromises supply chain. Eventually, at the root of all this, there's probably a pwn request, was always my initial thought. And I believe it is at one layer, as Shay mentioned, a lateral movement from Review Dog where a shared contributor had a pat stored in a GitHub workflow that was vulnerable to a pull request, to a pwn request. And that is how their pat was compromised. That is the current belief. But again, it could be that that is true and also not the only thing that went wrong here. As I felt with attributing TJ Actions to Review Dog, I was really nervous because people started pulling out like all sorts of sketchy looking GitHub actions in one of those two orgs that may have vulnerabilities that could conceivably be parallelly constructed as the root cause. So I do think it's a pwn request, and I think we understand what repo and what contributor at this point.
You mentioned something earlier, Rami, around like kind of taking the baton, like one person like figures something out and then the next, let's say readily available and or heavily resourced person takes the baton next. I feel like, and also to echo Shay, like there's so many things that happen. There's a lot of questions that are still around, like how do we investigate this and make sure like going forward, we have like specific boundaries or like awareness in place so we can like mitigate it. How is this, I guess the question, I'm trying to word this like in a correct way, like how is the platform that the open source community is hosted on not taking the baton to really like do that next level like deep dive on like what happened, like reviewing the logs and then kind of like stepping in and taking the baton honestly from the research that you guys have done and kind of like up leveling it with only insights that a specific platform can have. And in this case, like GitHub, right? Like, yes, it's an open source community, but there's a level of like responsibility and kind of going back to like regurgitating like terms like shared responsibility. Like there are clear like sides of which that like responsibility should fall on. And so how as like a research team, how is like a team leading something like this and kind of all eyes are on Wiz and what you guys are doing, how does this kind of like, how does this like iron out? Like how does this actually work in the sense of like passing the baton to someone that should also be contributing, like a GitHub?
I think it's change the things you can as it is. So we have been, consistently making sure, I think primarily actually working through maintainers to communicate with GitHub. Obviously, at various points we've communicated with GitHub directly, but I think for me, again, I'm really worried about the noise in this incident impeding response. It's something I learned from doing internal instance as a security engineer is like the last thing you need is 5 different people popping into the chat trying to be helpful. So we've been very careful so for example, we reported to Coinbase through their security disclosure pathway. We decided to go through the formal route. We sent them all of the information up front. We, for GitHub, have been working through maintainers and supporting maintainers, specifically the maintainer of Review Dog. We've been there making sure he feels empowered, they feel empowered to manage this incident and manage the information, but also know that we're available as technical resources. Fundamentally, I think that this is a challenging incident for a platform to look at because it does span that shared responsibility model. And I do think it is the first time we've seen this scale of issue in this ecosystem. And if you look at ecosystems like NPM, Python ecosystem, similar supply chains, it took them years of having instance like this to really figure out the right mitigations that balance usability and security. And so I'm hopeful that GitHub comes out of this with something really impressive about this instant, about the controls. They have some items on the roadmap I could very well, see getting pulled forward or not around how actions are referenced. But I also think that fundamentally, like GitHub does give people a lot of tools, and I think would be justified in pointing to those to some extent. Specifically, initial announcement about TJ Actions in the Wiz chat was, oh, this is scary. I've used this before. I think a lot of people do. I always hash pinned it because, like, it has been very clear for a couple years now to, I would say, more sophisticated actors in the space that GitHub Actions are really scary. And fundamentally, if you hash pin your actions, like there is complexity cost, but that's what you have to pay if you want to reference random pieces of third-party code as opposed to letting it update dynamically, I would say. And so to me, I think there is this balance where, like, if I were a person working in the ecosystem, not talking about the research perspective, not talking about GitHub themselves, there are a lot of things you can do to sort of mitigate, decrease your risk, harden yourselves. And I would say, like, look, we're a week and a half into this or whatever. I can't imagine this has been very fun for the responders at any of the implicated companies, not to mention all of the customers who have potentially seen instance downstream of this. I'm willing to give them a little time. And I think we're not past the point where most customers are still sorting their own side of the shared responsibility before the platform can really step in too much.
I do want to talk more about the remediations because there's more to go to there. But I want to go to you first, Shay, on like when we got, how did we get to Coinbase? Because we still haven't talked about that as explicitly.
Yeah, so Rami mentioned it, Hacker News comment. At that point, we had three target orgs, Coinbase, ReviewDoc, and the TG Actions. And what we've noticed that the common attacker behavior was to fork it and then do local development on the forks, and then perhaps, like in the ReviewDoc case, try to tag the commit from the fork. And so we went to the GitHub archive and just try to run a big queries to figure out which kind of users did suspicious activity in terms of forking local development. And we cross-correlated that with the users that don't exist at this point. And we turned up with 4 users.
How'd you get that idea? Like to check against non-existent users? That's really smart.
I just, once you hear about one of them, you immediately go to their page to at least to see, because GitHub gives you the UI and that says when the user started, right? We got 404. I said, cool.
I guess that is like, oh yeah, that raised a red flag.
That's right. That's one of the pivot components. So one of the pivot components was the repos and the orgs, and another one was this the existence of the users. That's how we turned up with 4 users and started looking at the actual log of the compromise. That's what gave us the skeleton of the timeline. Of course, not all the commits showed up there, but the ones that they created on their fork without impersonation, they did show up. And then I was interested in the payload. I wanted to see, so what kind of payloads how they developed that payload? Maybe they disclosed some kind of information on the way. And one of the payloads was actually one of the pushes was into the TG action that's explicitly referenced the Coinbase that said if fork owner is Coinbase or fork owner is the malicious username, do that. And that immediately tied TG actions with the Coinbase.
Yeah, on the one hand, it's like that's a very like James Berthotti special kind of way of coding something. Like it just feels so like if Coinbase. But at the same time, I don't know if there's something more sophisticated they could have done really to try to target that.
But it is funny, James, because this is like at first they wanted to be specific, right? They wanted to target specifically. At the end, looks like they gave up and just went broke.
That's why it felt like security research gone wrong, because it felt, I don't know, it felt very much like what I would do if I was goofing around. Like, how can I break this?
Well, I just want to do the high level on the payloads here that I was referencing where I think it's weird. This Coinbase payload was filtered down to a specific target in a way that implied they somewhat knew what they were doing and referenced a unknown payload that they called setup.py and hosted in gist that we don't have access to because that's been deleted. Then later than that, they went back to a memory dump payload that was, for action setup, I believe was the one where they had a memory dump payload that they directly dropped it into the code. Like they didn't reference a gist at all. And then they also had a gist that was just pulled off an internet example. And then in fact, for the poem request that is undisclosed so far, but early in this process, they were specifically, we think, using a open source tool, GattoX. So like there's the use of very well-known open source research tools and research payloads, but also like some things that feel pulled off wikis, but also a mix of hosted gists and injected code directly, knowing enough to know that payloads would be hidden if you modified like that JS file and it would get hidden in the UI, impersonating commits, but not always. Like we saw a series of commits where like 3 of them were impersonated and 2 were with the anonymous user. And then this use of like anonymous users, 2 of which had seemingly consistently random generated names that look like a password manager default, frankly, but one of which looks less random. And then prior to that, it looks kind of clearly connected to a real person's account that is in the crypto ecosystem. It all just is a very weird mix of sophistication levels and doesn't demonstrate a clean story, but that's what you get sometimes in these instances. And I think the best thing we can do is highlight this complexity and how that could confound attempts to tell a clean story here. Because as appealing as it is as researchers to tell a security researcher, worked backwards from Coinbase and submitted a bug bounty and Coinbase fixed it and then something went wrong, or like who knows what. That's not necessarily how these things develop.
That's a fascinating part of the story too, is Coinbase fixed it like 2 hours before Step Security disclosed it, right?
Coinbase fixed it 20 minutes before all the tags were redirected. So Coinbase actually seemingly, and again, this is all correlation, not causation, Coinbase removed their workflow that used TJ Actions changed files after the attacker targeted them specifically, but before the attacker went wide. And so in the security researcher case, you can tell a story, again, all made up, that they reached out to Coinbase. Coinbase immediately responded well, but then the researcher attacked the whole world with a payload that dumps things on the internet. Or you can tell the story where the attacker got caught by Coinbase somehow, thinks they got burned, and goes wide. And it's unclear which of those is actually the case right now, or something else entirely.
Yeah, I mean, that was to your point about eBPF monitoring and like how a lot of tools on runners would have caught it. Like it seems very feasible that they would have seen it, or if they're piping GitHub action logs to a SIM and like running some checks or something. Like
there was also, we mentioned it in our blog post. I'm not sure if it was mentioned elsewhere, but I specifically found what looked like a unsuccessful attempt prior to what we think is maybe the successful attempt on Coinbase, and that broke the run. And so a story you could tell is that Coinbase is a sophisticated organization. You assume they have running of their monitoring.
Their tests are not flaky, not a
yeah. No one has flaky tests in this industry. Right. No self-respecting organization has a test fail, in the normal course of business. And so they were right on top of it. And I do think it's important to mention that like the Coinbase repository that ended up being targeted was a open source project around AI and crypto. And so like what more could you want as a real attacker or as a bug bounty person than to find something that like gets you that good AI bonus and crypto bonus, whether maliciously or through a bug bounty?
Well, that's, to me, I think the closest thing we've seen to this, and let me know if you agree, was XZUtils. But that just felt so like sophisticated, targeted, like highly obvious. Like to me, that's the one that really scares me because it seemed like a freaking miracle that thing got detected. But yeah, I mean, that's where this differs so much in terms of like, it seems more like research than like a nation state kind of focused attack.
It also is
it's almost like if the attacker behind the XZUtils would perform this attack, they would cause so much damage and be so stealthy that I don't know whether we would have this podcast at this point.
Well, that I want to transition into both the response, but before that, even I feel like people are not freaked out enough about this stuff. I get that like there's a whole like micro supply chain security freak out org that's like constantly freaking out about this stuff, but I just feel like most companies are like, do you do supply chain security? The answer is like, yeah, I run SCA scanning. Oh, I scan with Sneak. Like, yeah, I'm doing supply chain security. But I just feel like we totally missed. Like, I think of vendors like Phylum, who recently like went to Checkmarks, is like they were doing a lot of like supply chain attack research, but it's hard to like build a commercial product around that. And I think as a result, we sort of end up like, I think a lot of people looked at this and went, oh, GitHub took the repo down. Like that was kind of their like, oh, TJ Actions is over.
I think you're hitting on, and again, it kind of goes back to like, to understand how you should be freaking out, you have to understand why behind it, right? And I think there's so many people that, one, don't truly understand like the scope of what happened, like what could have happened actually, like how close in proximity we all are to attacks like this, one. And then two, it kind of goes back to what you're saying around tools, like not touching it, but more so like we as like a community have gotten so used to like out of the box frameworks or like plug and go or like it's set up and so easy. And we kind of like have removed this layer of or a principle around like trusting and verifying the things that we're doing continuously. Like we've kind of stepped away and kind of have this like, oh, well, they removed it, it's done. Oh, like Wiz wrote about it, I'm sure it's fine now. Or like this GitHub seems safe, I'll just fork this one. And it's kind of like this, we stopped kind of caring about it, but like the scale and the scope is so close, and like it could, and again, if people didn't jump on it, if there wasn't a scanner randomly running it, like to Shay's point, like could we even have a podcast like this right now? We couldn't be like, you know, seemingly having a lighthearted like educational conversation around it, because we'd be like doing like recon and cleanup and trying to like salvage what we can.
I think that's always the obnoxious researcher perspective, just real quick on like, it is always, haha, look, I got this pwned payload, LOL, and then like some security engineer having to like pull their hair out patching everything.
Yeah, I think what I want to highlight with the near miss that I think has been lost in the conversation, and I don't know why, because it's so, everyone I talk to echoes it, but it's not getting out into those blog posts, into those, some companies have been like sending cold emails trying to sell their product based off this with like, hi, we notice you use TJ Actions in your public GitHub repo.
Get a scan. I've
Don't
gotten some
be
of
that
those ads.
person. Don't be that person. But if this TJ Actions payload had copied a different one off the internet that exfiltrated data, we would have gone from what we believe are, I would say 10 to 20 to 30, that order of organizations that had a sensitive secret leaked, to, I would easily say, hundreds of organizations with a sensitive secret exfiltrated directly to an attacker who could pretty trivially weaponize those. And again, speaks to the weird profile of the attacker, where if this were a sophisticated attacker, if this were an APT, I would fully expect they'd have this hooked up to their normal exploitation paths for leaked credentials. And we would have seen exfiltration, and we would have seen immediate usage of these, say, AWS credentials for SES spam usage or crypto mining, or however they're monetizing these days.
It brings me back to my MDR days of like, it's like the WannaCry kind of thing. It really seems like the next big freak out sort of ransomware kind of scenario will be something like this. That's like a supply chain takeover that, like, it's just so easy for me to see how this would have turned into like just a whole scramble, the likes of which we haven't seen since probably like Log4j, as far as like freak out, try to patch and fix.
Yeah, we need. I think bottom line, we need proper visibility to build this crazy scary tree with the lateral movement across the contributors. We need to add their GitHub apps as well. A
Yeah,
reusable workflow.
that's true.
We haven't talked about those, right? But each of them is an edge on the graph. So once we have all this ecosystem mapped, and actually GitHub started doing something like this with their dependency graph that they provide for public repos. It's a bit buggy and doesn't show all the dimensions, but it's a good start. I hope they'll keep working on it.
If only someone had a huge customer base, a lot of visibility into usage of GitHub Actions, and a graph-based tool that focuses on toxic combinations, maybe
Right.
eventually we would take our way out of this.
I wish.
I want to move to finally remediation stuff, like what would have prevented this. I've summed it up where on the maintainer side, like really signed commits would have gone a long way, just to make sure that you can't do like the identity spoofing. I think people miss how easy it is to do that.
The signed commits, though, wouldn't impact a fork and wouldn't impact tag changes. And the identity spoofing was primarily an obfuscation measure, not actually like they weren't sneaking PRs in with signed identities, right? So I don't actually know in this case that it would cut anything off. I think the tag changes is a huge highlight for us all of something that needs a lot of close eyes on it in the coming days.
Well, that's unfortunately, I think the other thing that I would point to is like the pat monitoring stuff. And that's really hard to do. Like if you're just some maintainer, as opposed to using like an NHI security product or like piping those to a SIM and like trying to do your own content around them. Like I think that's what makes this so hard, is there's not a clear example besides like, don't use pats if you can help it. Like maybe set up the ChainGuard Octo STS thing if you feel it, like if you're ready to take that on.
It's cool tech. I'm not recommending that across the board, though. Again, signed commits are heavy. The ChainGuard Octo STS thing, it's a heavy fix. I think fundamentally it is vendoring or hash pinning actions. And if you are looking at your code base, and I'm hearing this, like I hear the pain in organizations. They're looking at their code bases and they're saying, I have 10,000 repos, I have 15,000 GitHub actions I'm consuming. How am I ever going to hash pin them all? How am I ever going to vendor them all? Well, what you're saying is that you have some real risk you're carrying. And so you need to look at and talk about how you can prioritize. And again, prioritize places you're using secrets alongside, et cetera, et cetera. But fundamentally, like those are the two most powerful tools you're given right now.
And I think that's going back to us kind of leaning into being a little bit more instantaneous and wanting like tools to do it for us. There is a layer in security that's manual, or you have to accept the risk that you're introducing. And I think those are really hard conversations to have when you're a company trying to maintain like pace with, let's say, competitors, trying to keep your customers happy, trying to keep the lights on. Like there's so many different variables that get brought into the equation of like, do I do X? Do I accept X? And it's like those are conversations that people need to have internally. And I think going back to what we're saying here, like why were so many things missed? It's because of things that need to be talked about, tags, like maintainer like changes or like any admin type of changes. Those are conversations you have to like sit down and have, and those take time. And it's not sexy. It's not something that people want to do. And I think that's the hard truth.
It's yet another part of security where the more we empower developers, the more we like democratize the process of finding and fixing these issues in our code bases. In organizations I've worked in, this has not felt like such a heavy lift because we educate developers, we put in linting rules, security did some manual work. These were medium-sized organizations, by no means huge, but like if you get to the point where it is incumbent on the developer to hash pin a GitHub action they're consuming and they own that risk and they are provided with runtime context and whatever they need, like I think the organizations that are really feeling paralyzed here are the ones that are still in that legacy siloed centralized security model where they don't even talk to developers, let alone go out in the repos and fix things.
Well, I think that's such a challenge. Just from what I've seen, like it's been because most of my background's like mid-market SaaS kind of companies. And as I've worked with more like non-SaaS enterprise, like it is like they don't even know where to start because they've got like a bunch of Jenkins stuff and they've got all these like foreign development teams that are in different like technology stacks, different deployment methodologies. Like they're using GitHub, GitLab, local, Bitbucket on-prem was a recent, like I shed a tear for them. But like, that's the complexity of trying to manage like, yeah, where do you even start? And I do think there's a funny Reddit comment about the actions pinning that was like complaining that it was recommended. Like people's like, oh, people don't know how hard this is. And I'm like, yeah, but that's the like there's not another solution. Like I wish there was. But yeah, even that's not a complete solution, which is why I still go down to the runtime monitoring on CI/CD runners can be very noisy, which is I get why people don't do it. But fundamentally, like even if when you're pinning a commit, you're assuming still that the repo is okay when you're doing the commit pin. And if you end up over automating the process, you're back in this. This is why I was never big on like forking open source. Like it became cool to like fork it to your own internal registry, but then you're just auto patching and no one's looking at it. And so like, why is it forked in the first place? And I think that's what's challenging is it's still even pinning the actions is really more about making a conscious effort to like what's our patching strategy with open source. And I do think moving toward like open source is messier than this, but I think we have to like move more to just a patch Tuesday kind of mentality where like every security engineer knows their like Windows patching methodology where it's like we have a test group and we roll that out like 2 days after and then one or 2 weeks later we roll it out to the rest of the fleet. Like there's a clear methodology to it. And I think ultimately like that's what we have to move towards for containers and open source is just like a clear patching structure of picking those up, which is even beyond like the pinning actions piece.
Yeah, I think as a final note, and then we should wrap this up before everyone fully dips from this YouTube recording or podcast episode. I think that beyond patching, also just think about how the open source community plays a role, both from a risk perspective and also from how much we're reliant on open source maintainers. And like personal opinion, buy him a coffee. If your company is using TJ Actions 15 times, like, give them some support. They're doing a lot for all of us.
Latio Tech was the first sponsor of TJ. I'll have you know. Wiz, Jake?
Good point. Point taken. But I do want quickly say that looking at the number of maintainers, probably not a good idea because we saw with executils, one maintainer, not enough. 130 maintainers on ReviewDoc, still problem, right? I guess we need to forget about the metrics based on the based on the number of maintainers.
Yeah. And to also add a final note, we say maintainers, but we also have to remember some of these like sources aren't maintained. And if you're a user or a consumer of an open source like repo that you forked, you should assume you're a pseudo maintainer for your own like instance. So I think that's just one thing. Like, don't let the verbiage align to the definition. That's not the actual use case here.
Yes, if you are a big enough company to do it, having your developers actually patch stuff upstream is amazing thing to do.
And then get them access, and then please don't get
Yeah,
their
and then
path
turn them into
stolen.
a nation state rogue actor.
This is the longest last final note ever.
Yep.
We're all like,
Well, on that final note, thank you everyone for joining us today. Hopefully it was helpful. Hopefully we all can cry together about the state of supply chain security and how difficult and out there it is, but it's all getting a little better, hopefully, maybe. So thanks for tuning in. Thank you guys for joining me. See ya.
Thanks for having us. Bye bye.